Welcome to Nightverse lore! Oh geez, another dimension of naps!
Hey there, sleepyheads, glad to have you back. Before we slip into tonight's tale, I'd love to know where in the world you're watching from, and what time it is for you right now. The cellar beneath Nana Rose's pickle shop breathed with the patience of decades, its stone walls holding secrets in the spaces between shadows and lamplight. Rick was 6 when he first descended those worn wooden steps, each creak a gentle warning that he was entering somewhere sacred. The air tasted of summer afternoons distilled into glass, of dill and thyme and the quiet alchemy that happens when love learns to wait. Hundreds of mason jars lined the shelves like captured stars, their contents glowing amber and green, and deep ruby red in the soft light that filtered through the single basement window. To Rick, small and curious and drawn by something he couldn't name, they looked like a library written in colors instead of words. Nana Rose moved through this underground constellation with the reverence of someone who understood that preservation was prayer made visible. Her weathered hands knew each jar by touch, could read the stories held in brine the way other people read newspapers. She watched Rick with knowing eyes as he wandered between the shelves, his small fingers trailing along the cool glass surfaces, his face tilted up in wonder at the endless rows stretching toward the shadowed ceiling. When Rick pressed his palm against the smooth surface of a jar filled with whole dill pickles, something shifted in the quiet space around them. The glass felt warm under his touch, as if something inside was reaching back to meet him. Behind his closed eyelids, images bloomed like flowers opening to sunlight. A wooden rowboat rocking gently on a mirror-still lake, the scent of pine needles warming in afternoon sun, the sound of gentle laughter mixing with water, lapping against weathered wood. He saw hands, careful and loving, placing each cucumber into the jar with the tenderness reserved for tucking children into bed. The memory tasted of summer picnics and patient love, of someone wanting to preserve a perfect moment so it could be shared again and again. Rick pulled his hand back, startled, and found Nana Rose kneeling beside him, her arthritic knees protesting against the concrete floor. Her eyes held no surprise, only the gentle satisfaction of someone who had been waiting for this moment for years. "You felt it, didn't you, little star?" she whispered, her voice carrying the same reverence people used in churches. "That jar holds more than pickles. It holds the afternoon Mrs. Patterson made them for her grandson's first camping trip. She wanted him to have something that tasted like home, something that would remind him he was loved no matter how far into the wilderness he wandered." Rick looked up at her, his young mind struggling to understand the weight of what he'd experienced. "But how can a pickle remember?" Nana Rose smiled, the kind of smile that held both mystery and perfect clarity. "Everything remembers, sweetheart. The cucumber remembers the garden where it grew, the rain that nourished it, the hands that picked it. When we preserve something with care, with intention, with love, we're not just keeping it from spoiling. We're keeping all those memories safe, like pressing flowers between the pages of a book." She placed her own weathered hand over his small one, both palms resting against the jar. "Some people think pickling is just about vinegar and salt and thyme, but the real secret is understanding that every jar we fill is a letter to the future, a way of saying that this moment, this feeling, this love was worth keeping." That night, Rick lay in his small bed above the shop, listening to the gentle settling sounds of hundreds of jars breathing in the darkness below. The floorboards creaked with their own memories, and through the thin walls, he could hear the soft rhythm of Nana Rose humming the old pickling song that wasn't really about vegetables at all, but about holding precious things with gentle hands and knowing when to let them go. He understood now that the cellar wasn't just a storage room, but a sanctuary, a place where the ordinary act of preservation became something sacred. Each jar held not just food but intention, not just flavor but love transformed into something that could nourish both body and soul. The gift he'd discovered that day wasn't about magic or mystery, but about learning to listen with his heart to the stories that patience and care could tell. As sleep began to pull him under like warm water, Rick felt the weight of hundreds of preserved moments settling around him like a blanket. In the cellar below, the jars continued their quiet vigil, holding their memories safe in the darkness, waiting for the right person at the right moment to open them and taste the love that had been so carefully preserved within. The last thing he heard before dreams claimed him was the soft whisper of glass settling on wood, the gentle sigh of a building that had learned to hold precious things with infinite tenderness, and somewhere in that sound, the promise that some kinds of love could last forever if you just knew how to keep them safe. The morning after Rick's first communion with the jars dawned soft and golden, filtering through the small basement window like honey poured through cheesecloth. Rick woke with the strange sensation that something had shifted in the night, not in the world around him, but in the way he moved through it. The familiar sounds of the shop stirring to life above his head seemed to carry new meanings, each creak and settling sigh of old wood speaking a language he was only beginning to understand. He found himself drawn to the cellar before breakfast, his bare feet finding the worn wooden steps by memory. The air below held the same patient coolness, but now it felt welcoming rather than mysterious, like returning to a friend's house after a long absence. Nana Rose discovered him there, sitting cross-legged among the glowing jars, his small hands moving gently from one container to another as if greeting old acquaintances. "I wondered when you'd be back," she said, settling beside him with 2 steaming cups of chamomile tea. The ceramic felt warm against Rick's palms, and he breathed in the gentle floral scent while watching steam curl upward like tiny prayers. The jars have been humming all night. "I think they're excited to have someone who can truly listen." Nana Rose began that morning what would become Rick's gentle education in the art of preservation. But unlike the cooking lessons other grandmothers might offer, filled with measurements and temperatures and precise timing, this was something altogether different. This was learning to speak with vegetables, to understand the secret language of salt and time and patient transformation. Preservation isn't about keeping things exactly as they are. "Little star," she explained, her weathered hands moving with practiced grace as she selected cucumbers from a wooden crate. "It's about helping them become their truest, most generous selves. When we place a cucumber in brine, we're not stopping its journey. We're giving it a new path to travel." Rick watched as she held each cucumber up to the light, her fingers reading invisible stories written in the texture of skin and the firmness of flesh. Some she set aside with gentle apologies, others she placed in a growing pile of the chosen. When she handed him one to examine, Rick felt that familiar tingle in his fingertips, a warm recognition that this particular vegetable was ready for its transformation. "How do you know?" he asked, turning the cucumber in his small hands, feeling for whatever signal his grandmother could read so easily. "The same way you know when someone is ready to hear a difficult truth, or when a friend needs comfort instead of advice," she replied, beginning to slice the chosen cucumbers with meditative precision. "There's a readiness that you can feel if you pay attention. This cucumber has lived its full life in the garden. It's absorbed all the sunshine and rain it needs. Now it's ready to become something that can nourish people it will never meet, bring comfort to tables it will never see." They worked together in the quiet morning light, Rick learning that each ingredient served a purpose beyond flavor. The salt drew out the old water, making space for new tastes to take root. The vinegar provided the sharp clarity that awakened sleeping flavors. The dill and garlic and mustard seeds were like small gifts, memories of gardens and careful hands that would travel with each jar to its eventual home. But the most important ingredient, Nana Rose taught him, was intention. "You can follow any recipe perfectly," she said, guiding his hands as they layered cucumber slices with paper-thin onion rounds. "But if you don't hold space for the transformation to happen naturally, if you don't put love into the process, you'll end up with something that might taste right, but won't feed the soul." As they poured the warm brine over the waiting vegetables, Rick heard that soft sigh again, like the sound of someone settling into a warm bath after a long day. The cucumbers seemed to relax in their new environment, accepting the embrace of salt and acid and time. Rick placed his palm against the warm glass and felt the gentle vibration of transformation beginning, a quiet music that spoke of patience and trust, and the kind of love that helps things become more than they ever could have been alone. "Now comes the hardest part," Nana Rose said, sealing the jar with movements that looked like a blessing. "The waiting. Most people want to rush this part, to check if the magic is happening. But transformation requires faith. We create the right conditions, then we trust that the vegetables know how to become what they're meant to be." That afternoon, Rick learned to read the subtle signs of successful fermentation, the slight clouding of brine that meant beneficial bacteria had begun their work, The tiny bubbles that spoke of life happening in sealed spaces. The gradual shift in color as vegetables surrendered their old selves to become something new and more lasting. As evening settled over the shop like a familiar quilt, Rick helped Nana Rose label their day's work. But instead of simple dates and contents, they wrote small poems on the tags. Morning light for the cucumbers that had caught the dawn sun just right. Patient hearts for the batch that would need extra time to reach its full potential. Rick fell asleep that night to the gentle sound of transformation happening in the darkness below, dozens of jars breathing their quiet songs of becoming. In his dreams he was learning to speak a language older than words, where love was measured not in cups and teaspoons, but in the quality of attention paid to small, precious things, learning to become more than they had ever imagined possible. Days unfolded like patient ribbons after that morning of learning to wait, and Rick moved through them with a listening that didn't require his ears. The gift that had awakened in the cellar began to extend beyond the glass walls of mason jars, reaching into the ordinary moments of his 7-year-old life with gentle insistence. He could sense when the sourdough starter in Mrs. Chen's kitchen 3 blocks away was ready for feeding. Could feel the restless energy of apples hanging heavy on branches, waiting for the perfect moment to fall. But more than that, Rick began to recognize the same readiness in people that he felt in vegetables. He noticed it in the way some customers leaned toward the shelves, like plants sharing their longing with the sun, in how certain voices made the lids of jars glint differently, as if light rearranged itself to show him where comfort might be needed most. He started to discern who was in a state of being raw, needing the gentle embrace of understanding, and who was in a state of ferment, on the cusp of profound internal change, needing only the right conditions to fully transform. Nana Rose watched this development with knowing eyes, never rushing him toward understanding, but letting him discover the subtler layers on his own. Sometimes while they worked, she would hum the old pickling song in a low voice that seemed woven from steam and wood and the years themselves. Rick would feel the sound gather inside the jars like a gentle tide, lifting what was heavy without spilling anything over. It was Maya who taught Rick that his growing sensitivity extended far beyond vegetables and fermentation. She arrived at the shop on a blustery autumn afternoon, when the wind rattled the windows and the air outside carried the first crisp scent of wood smoke. She was perhaps 11, with hair the color of fallen leaves and eyes that looked perpetually on the verge of tears. Her clothes were a little too big, and she clutched a worn, threadbare book to her chest, as if it were the only thing holding her together. Maya didn't ask for anything, just stood by the counter shivering slightly, her gaze lost somewhere beyond the rows of glittering jars. Rick felt it instantly, a deep, aching sadness that seemed to cling to her like the cold outside. It wasn't the sharp, acidic sadness that might need a bracing, fiery pickle to cut through. No, this was a soft, bruised sadness, a quiet overwhelm that felt like a landscape shrouded in perpetual mist. Rick approached slowly, the way Nana Rose had taught him to move around delicate things that might startle easily. He could sense the story Maya carried: new school, new town, the exhausting work of trying to fit into spaces that felt foreign and unwelcoming. Her hurt tasted like cafeteria lunch eaten alone, like playground games she didn't understand, like lying awake in an unfamiliar bedroom, listening to unfamiliar sounds. Without fully understanding why, Rick found himself reaching for a particular jar from a special shelf in the back corner. These were the Tomorrow's Promise pickles, made with tiny young cucumbers, infused with delicate herbs like mint and lemon balm, and steeped in a slightly sweeter, milder brine. Nana Rose called them the Hope Pickles because they were meant to remind you that even the smallest, most vulnerable things could grow into something wonderful if given gentle care. He carefully selected a small jar, its green contents shimmering faintly, and brought it back to the counter. Maya hadn't moved, her gaze still fixed on some distant internal horizon. Rick gently placed the jar before her. "What's this?" she whispered, her voice reedy and thin, like a forgotten melody. "It's for empty bread plates and the kind of evenings where the house is too quiet but not peaceful," Rick said, the words coming from somewhere deeper than conscious thought. "It tastes like comfort and possibility." Maya looked from the jar to Rick's earnest face, then back to the jar. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and picked it up. The glass was cool against her fingers, But as she held it, Rick could almost feel the chill around her beginning to recede, replaced by a faint warmth. She twisted open the lid, and the delicate aroma of dill, mint, and something indefinably sweet wafted up. She took one out, a tiny, perfect cucumber, and bit into it. A slow, hesitant change spread across her face. Her brow, previously furrowed, smoothed out. Her lips, which had been pressed into a thin line, softened. A single silent tear tracked down her cheek, but this tear felt different, not of fresh pain, but of release, like a tiny drop of old brine escaping, making way for something new. "It tastes like my grandmother's garden," she murmured, her voice stronger now, tinged with fragile wonder. Before everything changed. Rick didn't always understand her words, but he understood her heart. He watched as Maya ate another pickle, and then another, each bite seeming to mend a tiny tear in the fabric of her spirit. The sadness didn't vanish entirely, but it softened like a sharp edge worn smooth by gentle currents. Nana Rose, having finished with another customer, watched the silent exchange with gentle recognition. She caught Rick's eye and offered a small knowing smile. She understood that Rick hadn't just given Maya a pickle. He had offered her a moment of preserved solace, a taste of hope, a gentle reminder that even when life felt too raw, there was always the possibility of becoming something comforting and new. Maya eventually left, clutching the empty jar like a treasure, a faint lightness in her step that hadn't been there before. Rick stood watching her go, a quiet sense of purpose settling in his chest like warm honey. He realized then that his gift wasn't just about preserving vegetables. It was about seeing the fragile, beautiful humanity in people and offering them the kind of gentle preservation they needed to transform their own bitterness into something nourishing. That evening, as they closed the shop, Nana Rose placed a weathered hand on Rick's shoulder. "You're learning to taste tomorrow in today's choices, little star," she said, her voice carrying the weight of recognition. Some people spend their whole lives trying to understand what you felt in that moment with Maya. As they descended into the cellar to check on the day's fermentations, Rick felt the weight of hundreds of patient transformations surrounding him like a constellation of possibilities. Each jar a reminder that the most important preservation happened not in brine and vinegar, but in the spaces between hearts where understanding bloomed like flowers, opening to gentle light. The weeks following Maya's visit settled into a rhythm that felt like breathing made visible, each day bringing Rick deeper into the mysteries Nana Rose had been waiting patiently to share. Maya returned twice more, each time a little less fragile, like a flower slowly unfurling its petals to morning light. Rick began to understand that healing wasn't a destination, but a gentle process, requiring nothing more than the right conditions and infinite patience, just like the transformations happening in every jar around them. It was during these quiet autumn afternoons that Nana Rose began revealing the deeper layers of their craft. She led Rick to a corner of the cellar he hadn't explored much, where ancient dark clay crocks sat like sleeping giants among the glittering glass jars. These held things that required longer, slower transformations, sauerkrauts and kimchis, root vegetables buried in salt, their flavors deepening over months, sometimes even years. "See these, little star," she murmured, her weathered hands tracing the smooth clay surfaces. "These are the stories that take a long, long time to tell. They aren't quick like the dill pickles which sing their song in a few weeks. These are the deep breaths, the long winters, the transformations that happen in the dark, when you think nothing is happening at all." She dipped a small wooden spoon into one of the crocks, offering Rick a taste of sauerkraut that had been fermenting for nearly a year. It was sharp, complex, with an underlying sweetness that spoke of profound change. The flavor bloomed across his tongue like a story unfolding, carrying notes of patience and surrender, of time itself becoming an ingredient. "This cabbage was once crisp and green, full of youthful vigor," she explained, her voice carrying the reverence of someone sharing sacred knowledge. "But it needed to be broken down, to sit in its own essence with just a little salt. It needed to release its old self bit by bit, to become something entirely new. And it took patience. So much patience." Rick understood that she wasn't just talking about cabbage. He thought of Maya, of how her sadness had needed to be acknowledged, to sit with them in the quiet of the shop, before it could begin its own slow transformation. Some pains, like some vegetables, couldn't be rushed. They needed the darkness, the quiet, the simple, steady presence of salt and thyme to become something nourishing. A storm rolled in that week, steady and silver, tapping the window panes as if asking to be allowed inside. The power flickered and then failed, and they lit beeswax candles that made the jars glow like small suns caught on shelves. The cellar held them in a warm, honeyed dusk, and Nana Rose hummed an old lullaby that didn't rush to its own ending as they worked by candle flame, measuring by feel and scent. "Salt is memory," she said, pinching crystals between her fingers, the candlelight catching the tiny facets like captured stars. "It helps us keep what matters. Vinegar is clarity. It reminds what's inside to wake and speak." Rain thrummed above them like a second heartbeat, and Rick felt held by the storm's embrace, safe in this underground sanctuary where transformation happened by its own gentle laws. She pulled down a jar filled with what looked like ordinary pickled beets, their deep purple color rich as velvet in the lamplight. But when she opened it, the scent that escaped was complex beyond description, earthy and sweet, with notes of something that tasted like childhood summers and the kind of contentment that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong. "These beets were made during the summer your grandfather proposed to me," she said, her voice carrying the weight of decades. "I was so nervous, so uncertain about whether I was ready for such a big change. I spent the whole day in this cellar, making batch after batch, trying to work through my fears. But these beets, they were different. When I held them, I could feel that they understood transformation, that they weren't afraid of becoming something new." Rick took the small piece she offered him, and as the flavor bloomed across his tongue, he felt it, the echo of young love, the trembling excitement of a life about to change in beautiful ways, the deep trust required to let yourself be transformed by another person's presence in your world. The beet tasted like courage made edible, like the moment when fear transforms into faith. "You preserved your feelings," Rick whispered, understanding flooding through him like warm light. "I preserved the moment when I realized that the best transformations happen when you're brave enough to trust the process," Nana Rose replied, sealing the jar with reverent care. "Every jar in this cellar holds not just food but wisdom, the accumulated understanding of what it means to change with grace, to become more than you were without losing the essence of who you are." Mrs. Patterson returned one afternoon, the same woman whose camping trip Pickles Rick had sensed in his first encounter with the jars. She looked tired, worn thin by something Rick couldn't immediately identify. When she asked for something to help with difficult conversations, Rick found himself reaching for a jar of pickled onions that had been aged in a brine infused with herbs, known for promoting patience and clarity. "These taste like honesty," he told her, the words arriving unbidden, the kind that doesn't hurt even when it's hard to hear. Mrs. Patterson looked at him with surprise, then with a recognition that seemed to reach across the years between them. "How did you know I needed to talk to my sister about our mother's care?" she asked softly. Rick didn't know how to explain that he could taste the weight of unspoken words in the air around her, could sense the love complicated by logistics and fear, and the terrible tenderness of watching someone you adore slowly forget who they are. Instead, he simply wrapped the jar carefully and watched as she left with something lighter in her step, armed with the kind of preserved courage that could help difficult truths taste like love. When the rain finally left, the garden behind the shop exhaled. Nana Rose took Rick out at dawn when the world is kindest, and they stepped into grass jeweled with dew. "We harvest early," she murmured. "The sun hasn't taught the plants how to be guarded yet." They moved through the rows, learning with fingertips, when a tomato asked to be left one more day, when a cucumber released from its stem like a small pop of gratitude. In a quiet corner, a bed had gone wild, forgotten under a tangle of vines. Rick reached for the overgrown cucumbers, yellowed, tough seeds set like stubborn stones. But Nana Rose shook her head. "Not everything wants to be kept," she said gently. "Some things want to return and feed the soil. That's a keeping too." They laid the old fruit in the compost, and the melancholy of letting go passed through Rick like a cloud shadow, cool and honest, leaving him a little more spacious than before. That night, the cellar's song felt fuller. Rick lay in bed listening to the hush below, as if the building were breathing for them all. Jars, shelves, sleeping herbs, resting hands. He realized that his education was expanding beyond technique into something that felt like learning to speak the language of the heart. Each jar in the cellar whispered its own story of transformation, and he was beginning to understand that his gift wasn't just about sensing readiness in vegetables, but about recognizing the moments when people were prepared to let themselves be gently transformed by the kind of love that preserves without possessing, that helps without changing the essential nature of what is held. The shop had become a sanctuary where ordinary transactions transformed into exchanges of understanding, where the simple act of selecting the right preserved food became a form of gentle healing. Rick fell asleep surrounded by the quiet humming of hundreds of ongoing transformations, his dreams filled with the soft music of becoming, the patient songs of love learning to last, and somewhere in that sound, the promise that his own transformation was just beginning, gentle as morning light, touching the first jar on the highest shelf. The morning Rick turned 13 arrived wrapped in the soft grey light of early winter, when the world holds its breath between seasons and the cellar's warmth feels like a secret shared between old friends. He woke with the strange sensation that something had shifted overnight, not in the shop around him or in the patient jars below, but in the way he carried himself through the spaces between heartbeats. The lessons of the past months had been settling into his bones like sediment in clear water, and now, on this quiet birthday morning, he felt the weight of his own readiness for transformation. The gift that had begun with touching glass jars had grown beyond the cellar walls, extending into every interaction, every moment of his daily life. He could sense the emotional weather of his classmates the way farmers read clouds, could feel the subtle shifts in mood that preceded tears or laughter. But with this expanding sensitivity came a new kind of vulnerability, a raw awareness that sometimes felt like walking through the world without skin. At school that day, the weight of being different pressed against him like ill-fitting clothes. During lunch, he sat at the edge of the cafeteria, watching groups of children cluster around shared jokes and whispered secrets. When he tried to join a conversation about weekend plans, his quiet observation about the way afternoon light made everything look golden was met with blank stares and uncomfortable silence. Someone laughed, not unkindly but not with understanding either, and the conversation moved on without him like water flowing around a stone. The feeling that settled in his chest was sharp and unfamiliar, like biting into a cucumber that hadn't yet learned to be sweet. It wasn't anger or sadness exactly, but something rawer, the particular ache of being seen but not understood, of having a gift that felt more like a burden when the world moved too fast and too loud for the kind of listening he offered. By the time he walked home, the winter air biting at his cheeks, the feeling had grown into something that demanded attention, something that needed tending. The shop's familiar scent of dill and patient time wrapped around him like a gentle embrace, but even that comfort felt distant. He nodded to Nana Rose, who looked up from her ledger with the kind of understanding that didn't require explanation, and made his way down the worn wooden steps into the cellar's patient darkness. Here, surrounded by hundreds of ongoing transformations, he felt the sharp edges of his pain more clearly, like examining a cut in good light. He sat on the old stool among the glowing jars and let the feeling wash over him completely. It tasted of loneliness and misunderstanding, of having something precious to offer that no one seemed to want. But as he sat there, breathing in the earthy air that held so many stories of successful transformation, Rick began to understand that this raw pain was exactly what the vegetables must feel before they surrendered to the brine. Vulnerable, uncertain but ready for something new. With the same reverence he'd learned from watching Nana Rose, Rick began to gather what he needed for his first conscious self-preservation. He selected small, firm cucumbers that reminded him of his own tender places, still growing, still becoming. For the brine, he chose ingredients that spoke to what he needed most: coarse salt for honesty about his pain, rice vinegar for the gentle clarity that didn't cut, fresh dill for the comfort of familiar things, and a single peppercorn for the strength to remain himself, even when the world didn't understand. As he prepared the brine, Rick spoke to his ingredients the way Nana Rose had taught him to speak to all precious things. "Help me hold this hurt without letting it turn bitter," he whispered to the salt as it dissolved. "Show me how to be clear without being sharp," he asked of the vinegar as it warmed. He placed each cucumber in the jar with the tenderness he wished the world would show his own sensitive places, covering them with brine that tasted like self-compassion made liquid. The transformation didn't happen immediately. Rick sat with the sealed jar in his lap, feeling the warmth of his own hands against the glass, and waited. Slowly, gradually, he felt something shift inside his chest. The sharp edges of his loneliness began to soften, not disappearing but changing shape, becoming something he could carry without it cutting his palms. The pain transformed into understanding, the isolation into a deeper empathy for anyone who had ever felt different, unseen, tender in a world that prized loudness over listening. When Maya appeared at the shop door just as the sun was setting, Rick felt ready to share what he'd learned. She moved with a new confidence now, her eyes bright with the kind of understanding that comes from having been gently held during transformation. She brought a friend, a quiet boy who carried the same raw vulnerability Rick had just learned to preserve with kindness. Rick offered them both a taste from his birthday jar, watching as the gentle Pickle helped them recognize their own capacity for self-compassion. In that moment, surrounded by the patient humming of hundreds of transformations, Rick understood that his gift was meant to multiply, to teach others the art of preserving their own tender places until they became sources of nourishment rather than pain. As the evening settled around them like a familiar quilt, Rick felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned to be gentle with his own becoming, who had discovered that the most profound transformations begin with the courage to hold your own hurt, with the same tenderness you would offer a friend. The cellar hummed with approval, and somewhere in that sound, Rick heard the promise of all the gentle healing yet to come. The seasons turned like pages in a well-loved book, each one deepening the channels of Rick's understanding as he grew from the tender boy who had first touched glass jars with wonder into a young man whose hands carried the same gentle certainty as Nana Rose's. By 18, the gift that had begun as childhood sensitivity had matured into something approaching mastery. Though Rick wore this wisdom with the humility of someone who understood that true knowledge lay not in knowing everything, but in remaining perpetually open to the stories that patience could tell. The shop had become a pilgrimage site of sorts, drawing people who carried hurts they couldn't quite name, seeking something they couldn't quite articulate, but recognized the moment they tasted it. Rick had learned to read the silent stories of those who entered, offering not just pickles, but the precise kind of preserved empathy they unknowingly sought. He could discern the bitter regret kneading the shop, cleansing bite of pickled onions, the quiet despair that found solace in the sweet, gentle embrace of fermented beets, or the raw anxiety that softened under the tender reassurance of his tomorrow's promise cucumbers. Yet as spring arrived with its familiar promise of renewal, Rick felt a subtle stirring within him, a gentle whisper that the beloved walls of the shop might be too small for the breadth of his growing understanding. It wasn't restlessness exactly, but rather an expansion, a sense that the quiet wisdom of preservation was meant to travel further, to reach those who might never find their way to Nana Rose's cellar. His grandmother, sensing this shift in him as easily as she sensed the turning of seasons, merely smiled one morning and gestured toward the old shed behind the shop. There, beneath a canvas cover weathered by decades, sat the family's traveling cart. Rick drew away the cloth like someone unveiling a sleeping friend, revealing wood worn smooth by countless journeys, iron-rimmed wheels that had sung their metal songs along cobblestone streets and dusty country lanes. The cart breathed with the patience of something that had waited faithfully for its next chapter to begin. "Your grandfather built this when I was about your age," Nana Rose said, her weathered hand tracing the cart's worn edges. "He had the same need you're developing, the same understanding that some gifts are meant to stay rooted, while others are meant to travel. This cart has carried our family's wisdom to places our feet never touched, brought comfort to tables we never saw." Rick spent the following weeks preparing for his first journey, his hands learning the cart's needs as thoroughly as he'd learned the cellar's rhythms. He reinforced the axles, oiled squeaky hinges, and built new shelves designed to cradle precious jars during their travels. As he worked, he felt the cart hum beneath his touch, a quiet anticipation that echoed his own. This was more than just a conveyance. It was a vessel of connection, a rolling sanctuary where transformation could happen on the open road. The morning he finally set out, dawn painted the sky in shades of hope and possibility. The cart, laden with its glittering cargo, found its rhythm on the cobblestone streets as Rick pushed it beyond the familiar boundaries of home. Each jar had been chosen with care, bright pickles for loneliness, tart cucumbers for hearts that needed gentle awakening, mellow onions for conversations requiring clarity without sting. He tucked simple cards among the jars with names that were more feeling than label. Soft start, evening porch, hold gently. The road taught him new rhythms. He learned to stop before he was tired, to leave before he was needed too much, to read the emotional weather of each town he entered. In village squares shaded by ancient trees, he set up his modest stall and watched people pause, drawn by something in the quiet brightness that asked for slower breaths. He met farmers whose harvests had failed, their faces etched with disappointment, and offered them pickles that tasted of resilience. He encountered artisans whose hands had grown frustrated with their work, and shared jars that spoke of the patience required to trust that beauty could emerge from apparent chaos. It was in the sun-drenched town of Millbrook that Rick first encountered Elena. Her bakery sat at the village's heart, its windows glowing warmly in the afternoon light. The air around it rich with the scent of yeast and flour and something else, a faint, persistent note of disappointment that made Rick pause outside her door. Through the window, he watched a young woman whose hands were perpetually dusted with flour, her movements carrying the particular tension of someone who had been trying too hard for too long. Elena was perhaps 20, with hair the color of autumn wheat and eyes that held the weary hope of someone who poured love into work that refused to respond as she dreamed it would. Rick could sense her frustration like a low hum beneath the bakery's warm atmosphere, the particular ache that comes from following every recipe perfectly, yet never achieving the magic that transforms mere ingredients into something that sings. When he entered, the bell above the door chiming softly, Elena looked up from kneading dough with a fierce determination that seemed to be wrestling with the very essence of the yeast. Her counter displayed beautiful pastries and hearty loaves, but Rick's attention was drawn to a covered bowl in the corner, her sourdough starter, pale and listless, bubbling weakly like something that had forgotten how to hope. "Your bread smells of honest effort," Rick offered gently, his voice carrying the same reverence he used in the cellar. "But perhaps it longs for a little more faith." Eleanor's hands stilled in their rhythmic work, flower motes dancing in the afternoon light between them. "Faith won't make a starter bubble," she replied, though her tone held more curiosity than defensiveness. "Only time and the right conditions." "And what is time?" Rick asked softly, if not faith made visible. He reached into his cart, selecting a jar of vegetables that had been preserved in the deepest, darkest brine, aged for months in the quiet of Nana Rose's cellar. The pickles within glowed like garnets in the afternoon light, their complex flavors achieved only through immense patience and trust in processes that couldn't be rushed or forced. "These learn to trust the darkness," he said, placing the jar on her flour-dusted counter. "They teach us that the most beautiful transformations require not just time, but a deep, unwavering belief in the process itself, even when the visible signs are slow to appear." Elena lifted the jar, her fingers tracing the patterns of preserved vegetables within. As she held it, Rick felt the subtle shift in her like a tight bud beginning to unfurl. She looked at her stubbornly flat sourdough, then back at the jar, understanding dawning in her honey-colored eyes. "So it's not about forcing it," she murmured, "but about creating the right conditions and then letting go." Rick simply nodded, watching as the seed of understanding took root. He left the jar with her, not as payment but as a gentle reminder, a tangible piece of preserved wisdom. As he guided his cart out of Millbrook, the evening air carrying the scent of Elena's honest efforts, he felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned that the most profound healing happened not through grand gestures, but through the quiet sharing of faith made edible, patience made tangible, and love preserved in forms that could nourish both body and soul. The road stretched ahead like an invitation, and Rick pushed his cart forward with the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered that his gift was meant to multiply, to teach others the gentle art of trusting in transformations that happen not through force, but through the kind of patient attention that honored the natural. Wisdom already present in every living thing, the road beyond Millbrook wound through countryside that seemed to breathe with increasing difficulty, each mile carrying Rick deeper into territories where hope had learned to walk more carefully. The encounter with Elena lingered in his thoughts like the aftertaste of perfectly aged brine, complex, satisfying, tinged with the promise of transformations yet to unfold. Her sourdough starter had been ready to trust. She had simply needed someone to remind her that faith was an ingredient too. But as his cart's wheels found their rhythm on the dusty path, Rick felt the emotional weather shifting around him, growing heavier, more complicated. The villages he passed through wore their struggles differently than any he'd encountered before. These weren't places touched by recent disappointment or temporary setbacks, but communities that had been marinating in accumulated bitterness for so long that cynicism had become their native language. In market squares, conversations carried the particular weight of people who had learned not to expect much from tomorrow. Children played with a subdued energy, as if joy itself had been rationed. Even the light seemed dimmer here, filtered through an atmosphere thick with unspoken news. Resignation. It was in the town of Millfield that Rick encountered his first true test of the deeper preservation arts Nana Rose had hinted at during those quiet cellar lessons. The town sat in what should have been fertile valley land, but everything here carried the grey pallor of dreams deferred too many times. The mill that had once been the community's heartbeat stood silent, its wheel motionless in water that barely whispered. Promises of renewal had come and gone like seasons, each failure adding another layer to the collective armor these people wore against further disappointment. Rick set up his cart beneath a weathered oak whose branches seemed to droop with the weight of witnessed sorrows. The usual curious glances that greeted him elsewhere were absent here, replaced by the studied indifference of people who had learned that hope was a luxury they couldn't afford. Hours passed with only perfunctory interactions, coins exchanged for jars without the conversations that usually revealed where healing was needed most. As evening approached, Rick began to understand that this place required something entirely different from him. The gentle pickles that had brought comfort elsewhere felt inadequate here, like offering whispered reassurances to someone drowning in deep water. The bitterness that permeated Millfield wasn't the sharp, clean pain that could be soothed with sweet preservation, but something more corrosive, disappointment that had fermented into cynicism, turning the heart's natural capacity for hope into something toxic. That night Rick made camp at the town's edge, his cart pulled beneath an ancient willow that seemed to understand the weight of carrying sorrow. As stars emerged cold and distant in the clear sky, he felt drawn towards something he had never attempted before. He remembered Nana Rose's words about the clay crocks in their cellar, about transformations that required the darkest brine, not cruelty, but the kind of profound acceptance that could hold even the most wounded hearts while they slowly healed. Rick began to work by moonlight, his hands moving with certainty that came not from conscious knowledge but from deep trust in processes larger than understanding. He selected vegetables that others might have discarded, tomatoes with small bruises, onions whose outer layers had begun to brown, cucumbers slightly past their prime. These were the wounded ones, the overlooked ones, carrying their own stories of disappointment and resilience. The brine he prepared was unlike any he had made before. To the usual salt and vinegar, he added ingredients that spoke of endurance rather than comfort. Bitter herbs that had learned to find sweetness in harsh soil, roots that had survived winter's worst cruelties, spices that carried memories of distant places where people had learned to make nourishment from scarcity. As he worked, Rick felt himself entering a state of preservation that was more prayer than process, more communion with darkness than celebration of light. As dawn broke hesitant and grey over Millfield, Rick knew something fundamental had shifted. The jars that had worked through the night glowed with different light, their contents dark and complex, carrying flavors that spoke not of simple comfort, but of the kind of nourishment that could only come from having faced the worst and found a way to transform it into something life-giving. When the first townsperson approached his cart, an elderly farmer whose fields had failed 3 seasons running, Rick offered a taste from the dark jars. The flavor that bloomed across the man's weathered features was complex beyond description, sharp enough to cut through cynicism, bitter enough to honor real pain, but carrying underneath it all a profound recognition that even the most damaged things could be transformed into nourishment if held with the right kind of love. "It tastes like—" The farmer paused, his voice thick with unexpected emotion, "like my grandfather's stories about the Dust Bowl years, when they learned to make soup from stones and somehow still found reasons to be grateful. Rick understood then that the deepest preservation wasn't about protecting things from darkness, but about creating conditions where even the most wounded could find their way to a new kind of wholeness. As he prepared to leave Millfield the next morning, he felt the profound satisfaction of someone who had learned that his gift extended even into the hardest places, carrying the promise that no bitterness was so deep it couldn't be transformed by the right kind of patient, loving attention. The lessons of Millfield traveled with Rick like the complex aftertaste of his darkest brine, bitter at first touch, then revealing layers of unexpected wisdom that only emerged with patient reflection. As his cart's wheels found their familiar rhythm on the dusty road, he felt the weight of what he'd learned settling into his bones, that some transformations required not just gentle encouragement, but the profound acceptance that could hold even the most wounded places while they slowly found their way to healing. The experience had expanded his understanding of preservation beyond comfort into the realm of genuine alchemy. Where darkness itself could become nourishment, it was this deeper wisdom that guided his path as it curved back toward Millbrook, drawn by an inexplicable pull that felt like following a melody half remembered from dreams. When Elena's bakery came into view, Rick immediately sensed the change that had settled over the building, like morning light after a long night. The air around the shop hummed with a different energy, not the tense determination he'd felt before, but something that spoke of successful surrender, of faith finally rewarded with the kind of magic that happens when trust meets perfect timing. Elena emerged from her bakery as Rick approached, and the transformation in her was immediately apparent. Where before she had moved with the rigid determination of someone fighting against invisible resistance, now her gestures carried the fluid confidence of someone who had learned to dance with forces larger than her will. Her hands, still dusted with flour, moved with a new kind of grace, and her eyes held the particular brightness of someone who had discovered that surrender could be the most powerful form of mastery. "Rick," she called, her voice carrying notes of excitement and gratitude that made the air around them seem to sparkle with possibility. "You have to see what happened. You have to taste what patience can do when it finally finds its voice." She led him into the bakery, where the aroma that greeted him was unlike anything he had ever experienced. It wasn't just the scent of baking bread, but something more complex, the fragrance of time made edible, of trust transformed into sustenance that could nourish both body and soul. The sourdough starter that had been pale and listless during his previous visit now bubbled with vigorous life, its surface dancing with the kind of energy that spoke of microscopic communities working in perfect harmony, each tiny organism contributing to a symphony of transformation. "It took 3 weeks," Elena explained, her words tumbling over each other with the enthusiasm of someone sharing a miracle. 3 weeks of just letting go, of feeding it with love instead of anxiety, of trusting that it knew what it needed better than I did. And then one morning I came down to find it had doubled overnight, singing with bubbles, ready to become bread that actually rises and sings. She showed him loaves that seemed to glow from within, their crusts golden and crackling with the tiny fissures that spoke of perfect fermentation. When she broke one open, the interior revealed itself like a prayer made visible, airy, complex, filled with irregular holes that caught the light like captured joy. The taste, when Rick accepted her offered piece, was a revelation, tangy and sweet, complex and comforting, carrying flavors that could only emerge from the marriage of patience and absolute faith in the process. "It's exactly like your pickles," Elena said, watching his face as he savored the bread, her own expression bright with understanding. "The transformation doesn't happen because you force it, but because you create the right conditions and then trust the process completely. The starter taught me that some of the most beautiful things in life require us to step back and let them become what they're meant to be." As they worked together that afternoon, Rick and Elena discovered the profound parallels between their crafts. Both involved taking simple, raw ingredients and, through careful stewardship and patient waiting, coaxing them into something more complex, more nourishing, more alive than the sum of their parts. Elena's sourdough starter was a living community of wild yeasts and beneficial bacteria, much like the microbial ecosystems that transformed Rick's vegetables in their briny sanctuaries. "Each time I feed it," Elena explained, her hands gently stirring the bubbling culture. "I'm nourishing a whole ecosystem. If I'm impatient, if I neglect it, if I try to rush its growth, the whole community suffers. But if I give it what it needs, warmth, good flour, water, and most importantly, time and attention, it rewards me with this incredible life force." Rick felt the familiar warmth of shared understanding spreading through his chest. "The same with brine," he replied, selecting a jar from his cart. "People think it's just salt and vinegar, but it's a living conversation. Each beneficial bacterium, each tiny organism working to transform bitterness into something that can nourish. They need the right balance, the right environment, the right kind of patient love to flourish." Their conversation flowed like the gentle bubbling of fermentation itself, weaving between the practicalities of yeast and vegetables and the deeper philosophies of patience, surrender, and the unseen forces of transformation. Rick showed Elena how different brines encourage different microbial communities, creating unique emotional flavors, while she demonstrated the gentle folding techniques that developed gluten without overworking the dough, the long, slow fermentation that happened in the cool darkness of night. As evening settled around them, like a familiar blanket, Rick felt something profound shifting in the space between them, a recognition that went deeper than friendship or attraction, though both were present, into the realm of shared purpose. Elena's journey with bread had awakened the same sensitivity to living processes that guided his work with preservation. Her bakery had become another kind of sanctuary, a place where the ordinary miracle of fermentation revealed itself as something sacred. "I want to learn more," Elena said, her voice carrying the quiet intensity of someone who had glimpsed a larger truth. "About fermentation, about the way living things transform each other, about how bread and pickles are really part of the same conversation about time and trust and the kind of love that helps things become more than they could be alone." Rick felt the familiar pull of the open road calling to him, filled with communities needing the kind of healing that only patient preservation could provide. But now that calling was complicated by the recognition that some of life's most important transformations happen not in solitude, but in the space between hearts, learning to trust the same profound processes. In Elena, he had found not just a friend, but a kindred spirit who understood that their work was about more than food. It was about creating conditions where the deepest healing could unfold, one gentle transformation at a time. The cart waited beneath the emerging stars, its jars humming with their own patient songs, while Rick stood at the threshold between the familiar pull of his solitary journey and the unexpected invitation of deeper connection, knowing that whatever path he chose, he carried with him the profound understanding that the most beautiful transformations often happened when two hearts learned to trust the same sacred processes of becoming. The recognition that had passed between Rick and Eleanor in those final moments of evening settled into something deeper than words as the days that followed unfolded like pages in a well-loved recipe book. Rick found himself lingering in Millbrook, not from indecision, but from the growing understanding that some transformations required the kind of sustained attention that could only happen when you stopped moving long enough to witness the subtle changes that patience could bring. Eleanor offered him the small room above her bakery, a space that caught the morning light through windows overlooking the square where his cart had first taught him about the profound connections between individual healing and community nourishment. There, collaboration began with the simple curiosity that marks all true discoveries. Eleanor wondered aloud whether the wild yeasts that made her sourdough sing might have something to offer Rick's fermentation process, while Rick found himself fascinated by the living communities that bubbled and thrived in her carefully tended starters. They began leaving small experiments near each other's workspaces, Elena placing bowls of different flour combinations beside Rick's fermenting vegetables, Rick positioning jars of various brines near Elena's proofing baskets, both of them curious about the conversations that might emerge between their different but related forms of alchemy. The first breakthrough came on a morning when autumn light slanted golden through the bakery windows, illuminating the gentle dance of bubbles in a jar, where Rick's pickled radishes were fermenting alongside a small portion of Elena's sourdough discard. The vegetables had developed an effervescence that made them shimmer in their brine, their usual sharp bite softened by the complex sweetness that only emerged when different forms of beneficial bacteria learned to work in harmony. "Taste this," Elena whispered, her voice carrying the reverence of someone witnessing a small miracle. When Rick accepted the offered radish, the flavor that bloomed across his tongue was unlike anything he had experienced, tangy and complex, with a lightness that seemed to lift both palate and spirit. It tasted like collaboration made edible, like the moment when two different forms of wisdom recognize each other and decide to grow together rather than apart. Their shared experiments became a form of conversation that required no words, each discovery leading naturally to the next question, each small success opening doorways to deeper understanding. Rick learned that Elena's bread cultures could add layers of complexity to his vegetable fermentations that he had never imagined possible, while Elena discovered that the gentle acidity of Rick's brines could encourage more nuanced flavor development in her sourdough, creating loaves that carried subtle notes of the preserved vegetables aging in the cellar below. It was Mrs. Chen from the tea shop who presented them with their first real collaborative challenge. She arrived at the bakery on a grey afternoon, when the first frost had touched the windows with delicate patterns, carrying the particular weight of someone whose grief had settled into her bones like winter cold. Her husband had passed the previous spring, and the isolation of her mourning had transformed what should have been healing solitude into something that felt more like slow starvation of the spirit. "I don't know how to eat alone," she confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. "Everything tastes like emptiness now. I make tea for two out of habit, then remember. I buy groceries for meals I don't have the heart to cook. Food has forgotten how to comfort me." Rick felt the familiar pull of recognition, understanding immediately that Mrs. Chen needed something more complex than simple comfort food. Her grief wasn't the sharp, fresh pain that could be soothed with gentle pickles, but the deeper ache of someone learning to rebuild the basic rhythms of daily life around a permanent absence. This required the kind of preservation that could help her remember that nourishment was still possible, that meals could be both acknowledgement of loss and gentle celebration of continuing life. Elena understood without explanation, moving to prepare a special loaf while Rick gathered ingredients for what would become their most collaborative creation yet. They worked in the quiet harmony that had developed between them. Elena shaping bread dough enriched with a touch of whole grain for warmth and substance, Rick preparing a brine that would complement the bread's earthy sweetness with the kind of gentle complexity that could awaken dormant appetite. The vegetables Rick selected spoke of resilience and renewal, small turnips that had sweetened after the first frost, carrots that had concentrated their sugars during cold nights, cabbage leaves that had learned to be tender under winter's patient teaching. The brine he created was unlike any he had made before, incorporating not just Elena's sourdough culture, but also a whisper of the green tea Mrs. Chen favored, creating a fermentation environment that would produce flavors both familiar and gently surprising. As they worked, Elena hummed the old pickling song Rick had learned from Nana Rose, her voice weaving through the bakery's warm air like a blessing. The bread rose slowly in the cool afternoon, while the vegetables settled into their transformative bath with the kind of quiet acceptance that spoke of successful preservation beginning. They didn't rush the process, understanding that Mrs. Chen's healing would require the same patient attention they were giving to their collaborative creation. When Mrs. Chen returned a week later, the bread and pickles had found their perfect harmony. The loaf Elena offered was dense with nourishment, but light in texture, its crumb open enough to cradle thin slices of the fermented vegetables. The pickles themselves carried flavors that seemed to tell a story, the initial sharpness of acknowledgement, followed by deeper notes of comfort, finishing with a subtle sweetness that whispered of hope without demanding immediate joy. Mrs. Chen took a small bite, and Rick watched as something shifted in her face, a gentle relaxation that spoke of appetite remembered, of the possibility that meals could once again be acts of self-care rather than mere survival. "It tastes like," she paused, searching for words, "like the way my grandmother used to make simple things special. Like food that understands you're eating alone, but doesn't make you feel lonely." As winter deepened around Millbrook, Rick and Elena continued their gentle experiments, each collaboration teaching them more about the profound connections between different forms of fermentation. different ways of transforming simple ingredients into something that could nourish both body and soul. Their work had evolved beyond individual craft into something that could only exist in the space between them, a seabed partnership that multiplied their capacity to offer exactly the kind of preserved comfort each person needed, whether they could name it or not. The cart waited patiently in the shed behind the bakery, its jars empty but ready, while Rick learned that some of life's most important transformations happened not in solitude, but in the gentle space between hearts committed to the same sacred work of helping others discover that healing, like fermentation, was always possible when the right conditions were created with infinite patience and love. Winter deepened its gentle hold on Millbrook as Rick and Elena's collaborative work began to attract the kind of quiet attention that spreads through communities of craftspeople. Like the subtle fragrance of well-aged brine, word traveled in whispered conversations between bakers and fermenters, in letters that smelled of sourdough and dill, carrying news of a bakery where bread and pickles had learned to sing together in harmonies that could heal hearts as readily as they nourished bodies. Their reputation grew not through proclamation, but through the simple evidence of people leaving their shop with lighter steps and clearer eyes. It was on a morning when frost painted the windows with patterns that looked like preserved lace that Samuel arrived, stepping into the bakery with the unhurried certainty of someone who had been expected long before he was seen. He was tall in the way old trees are tall, carrying himself with the quiet authority of someone who had spent decades listening to the secret conversations between salt and thyme. His coat bore the patient wear of many seasons, and his leather satchel exhaled the complex aromatics of aged vinegars and well-tended cultures. He ordered simply a thick slice of Elena's sourdough and a small portion of Rick's winter vegetables, then ate with the deliberate attention of someone reading a story written in flavors. When he finished, he set down his fork with the finality of a blessing and looked toward Rick with eyes that held the same patient depth as Nana Rose's cellar. "Your grandmother wrote to me about you years ago," he said, his voice carrying the warmth of wood smoke and long conversations. "She told me to come when the bread learned to rise with the rhythm of fermentation, when two crafts became one conversation. I'm Samuel, and I've been walking toward this bakery for longer than you might imagine." The mention of Nana Rose filled the room like the scent of familiar herbs, bringing the distant cellar close enough to touch. Rick felt time fold gently, connecting this moment to all the patient lessons that had led him here, to this recognition that his education was about to deepen in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Samuel didn't arrive with grand proclamations or revolutionary techniques. Instead, he brought the gift of attention, the kind that lives in fingertips and breath and the spaces between heartbeats. He watched Rick and Elena work, then made small adjustments. The angle of a jar's lid to encourage better airflow, the depth of a brine to create optimal conditions for beneficial bacteria, the way hands could rest on fermenting vessels to sense the subtle communications happening within. "Listen deeper," he murmured as Rick checked a batch of fermenting turnips. Not just to the bubbling, but to the quality of the silence between bubbles. Some ferments whisper when they're content, others hum when they're working too hard. Each one has its own voice if you learn to hear it. Under Samuel's gentle guidance, Rick began to distinguish between the effervescent joy of successful fermentation and the anxious fizzing that spoke of imbalance. He learned to recognize when a culture was asking for more darkness, more quiet, more time to complete its mysterious work. Samuel introduced them to the patient art of vinegar making, starting with a trembling mother culture that looked like a small moon caught in amber liquid. "This is a companion, not a project," Samuel explained, covering the bowl with cloth that allowed breath while keeping dust away. "You'll care for her, and she'll transform your scraps into liquid that can clarify and brighten for decades. But only if you trust her timing, not your own." The most profound lesson came when one of Rick's experimental ferments, radishes that had been bubbling with promising enthusiasm, suddenly expanded too quickly in a warm spell, developing the wrong kind of insistence. Rick felt shame rise like an overfull boil, wanting to rescue and salvage, to prove his mastery by refusing failure. Samuel's gentle hand stopped him with the lightness of a moth landing. "Some things ask to return," he said softly. "Compost is a promise kept, not a failure acknowledged. We don't make trophies of what wanted to become soil. Together, they carried the jar to the compost heap behind the bakery, where steam rose from the dark mound like the breath of a patient animal. As Rick poured the bright, over-fermented radishes into the earth, he felt something profound shift in his understanding. The heap accepted them without judgment, and Rick realized that letting go was sometimes the most loving form of preservation, allowing what had served its purpose to nourish new growth. Samuel taught them to recognize the moments when offering healing would be an intrusion rather than a kindness. When Mrs. Patterson arrived, carrying fresh grief over her mother's declining memory, Samuel guided Rick to simply witness her pain without immediately reaching for a jar that might ease it. "Some sorrow needs to be fully felt before it can transform," he whispered. "Our job is to hold space for that feeling, not to rush it toward resolution." As winter began its slow retreat, Samuel prepared to continue his own journey. On his final morning, he left 2 gifts beside the vinegar mother: a short-bladed knife with a handle worn smooth by countless hands, and a thin notebook whose first page bore a single line in careful script: "We do not fix what is broken. We hold it long enough to remember it was whole." He embraced Elena with the awkward tenderness of someone more accustomed to cradling crocs than people, then stood with Rick in the doorway as morning light spread across the square. "Your grandmother told me your gift would grow quieter as it grew stronger," he said, eyes twinkling with gentle mischief. "That has begun. Remember, every person who comes to you is already carrying their own perfect culture. You are not their architect. You are their weather." As Samuel disappeared into the brightening day like steam dissolving into memory, Rick felt the space he left like a hand removed from his back. Cool, vulnerable, but somehow more upright. The bakery filled with ordinary sounds again. But Rick carried within him the profound understanding that true mastery lay not in always knowing what to offer, but in recognizing when to offer nothing at all, when the most loving service was simply creating conditions where others could discover their own readiness for transformation. The cart waited patiently in its shed, its empty shelves reflecting lamplight like promises held in reserve, ready for whatever the road ahead might require. The quiet Samuel left behind settled into the bakery like flour dusting a wooden board, changing everything without demanding attention. Rick felt the shift in his understanding like sediment, settling in clear water. Samuel's lessons about being weather rather than architect for others' transformations had become part of his breathing, part of the way he moved through the world with hands that knew when to offer and when to simply witness. The morning light seemed different now, carrying whispers of a pull that had been growing stronger with each passing day, a gentle insistence that felt like being called home by a voice he recognized in his bones. Helena sensed the change in him before he spoke it aloud, the way she could feel when her sourdough was ready to be shaped without consulting any clock. They worked together in the pre-dawn quiet, her hands folding tomorrow's bread, while his prepared the day's first batch of morning pickles, vegetables that had learned to wake gently, carrying flavors that eased the transition from sleep to consciousness. The rhythm between them had become so natural, they moved like parts of a single organism, each anticipating the other's needs without conscious thought. "You're thinking about home," she said softly, her words carrying no judgment, only the recognition that some conversations arrived with the inevitability of sunrise. Rick nodded, his hands stilling in their work, as he felt the truth settle between them like morning light finding its way through windows. "Nana Rose is getting older. The shop needs someone who can carry it forward, who understands what it's meant to become." He paused, watching steam rise from the warm brine he'd been preparing. "But I don't want to go back to doing this work alone." Elena's smile arrived slowly, like flowers opening to warmth. "Then don't," she said simply, and in those 2 words, Rick heard the echo of every patient transformation they had witnessed together. The letter that arrived 3 days later confirmed what his heart had already known. Nana Rose's handwriting wobbled slightly, but remained unmistakable, the words spare and trusting like a recipe that had learned to rely on intuition. "The garden is waking. The cellar misses your footsteps. Come when you're ready, little star." No urgency, just an invitation that felt like warm light cupped in patient hands. They packed with the same deliberate care they brought to their fermentation work, Eleanor wrapping a piece of her strongest sourdough mother in damp cloth, Rick nestling his most complex brines into protective straw. These weren't just ingredients they were carrying, but living conversations, cultures that would continue their gentle transformations wherever they found themselves planted. The journey home unfolded like a meditation on returning, each familiar landmark greeting them with the warmth of recognition. The cart found its old rhythm on roads that remembered its wheels, while Elena walked beside it, her presence transforming what might have been melancholy into something that felt more like completion. They stopped to rest in the shade of trees that had sheltered Rick during his earlier travels, sharing simple meals that tasted of anticipation and the kind of happiness that doesn't need to announce itself. When the shop's weathered sign came into view, Rick felt time fold gently, connecting the boy who had first touched glass jars with wonder to the man who now understood that his gift was meant to multiply, to create spaces where others could discover their own capacity for gentle transformation. Nana Rose appeared in the doorway before they reached it, her eyes bright with the particular satisfaction of someone whose patience has been rewarded exactly as she had known it would be. "So you've brought the baker," she said, embracing Elena with immediate acceptance. "I've been saving a corner of the cellar for sourdough cultures. The jars have been humming about bread for months." The transition happened with organic ease, each day bringing small adjustments that felt less like upheaval than like natural growth. Eleanor's cultures settled into the cellar's patient atmosphere as if they had always belonged there, while the shop expanded without losing its essential character, becoming a place where ancient arts could converse in the language of beneficial bacteria and patient time. Under Rick's gentle guidance, the shop slowly transformed into something beyond commerce. The counter became a meeting point where stories were exchanged as freely as goods. Rick arranged a comfortable bench by the window, where morning light could warm those who needed to sit and breathe, filling it with soft cushions and placing a small wooden bowl of Nana Roses, hope seeds nearby, smooth stones that invited touch and reminded visitors that growth could begin. With the smallest gesture of faith, Maya returned. On a crisp autumn afternoon, now grown into a young woman whose early fragility had transformed into quiet strength. She carried the particular weight of someone processing a recent ending, a relationship that had taught her important lessons about her own boundaries. Rick felt the familiar recognition of someone ready for nourishment that could acknowledge what was ending while celebrating what was beginning. Together with Elena, he created what they came to call a transition meal, sourdough dense with complex flavors that only emerged from slow fermentation, paired with Rick's new chapter pickles, vegetables that had learned to be both tart and sweet. Maya ate slowly, tears mixing with laughter, as she recognized the flavors of her own journey reflected in the food before her. "It tastes like growing up," she said, wonder threading through her voice. "Like learning you can be grateful for what taught you, even when you're ready to let it go." As winter settled over the shop like a familiar quilt, Rick felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned that the most profound preservation happened not in individual jars, but in the communities that formed around shared understanding. The cellar hummed with approval in the patient darkness, each jar a testament to the truth that love, like fermentation, multiplied when shared, creating conditions where even the most ordinary ingredients could become extraordinary through the simple gift of attention paid with infinite tenderness. The weeks following Samuel's departure settled into the shop like flour finding its level in a measuring cup. His lessons about being weather rather than architect, becoming part of the way Rick and Elena moved through their days with quiet certainty. Spring arrived with its familiar invitation to renewal, and with it came the gentle expansion of their community in ways that felt as natural as yeast finding its way into willing dough. The library down the cobblestone street had become a regular stop for Elena's Tuesday bread deliveries, a ritual that began as simple kindness and grew into something more complex, more nourishing, as the best relationships do. It was there that Elena met Thomas, the head librarian, whose voice carried the same patient reverence for stories that Elena brought to her sourdough cultures. He was a man who understood that both books and bread required careful tending, that the most beautiful things emerged not from force, but from creating conditions where natural processes could unfold in their own time. Rick watched their friendship develop with the same gentle attention he paid to his most delicate fermentations, recognizing the subtle signs of two hearts, learning to trust the same rhythm. Thomas began visiting the shop on quiet afternoons, drawn not just by Elena's bread, but by the atmosphere of patient transformation that permeated the space. He would sit at the small table near the window, reading while Elena worked, occasionally sharing passages that seemed to capture the essence of what they were all doing, preserving precious things, creating conditions for growth, understanding that the most profound changes happen slowly, with love, in the safety of acceptance. When Elena confessed to Rick that she thought she might be falling in love, her words carried the same wonder he'd heard in her voice when her sourdough first learned to sing. "It feels like fermentation," she said, her hands moving gently through bread dough as she spoke. "Something alive growing between us, something that can't be rushed but shouldn't be ignored." Rick felt the familiar warmth of recognition, understanding that Elena had found someone who appreciated the same mysteries that guided their work. Thomas wasn't just attracted to Elena's skill with bread, but to her understanding that nourishment was about more than feeding the body. It was about creating spaces where people could taste the love that had been carefully preserved in every bite. The proposal came on a morning when apple blossoms perfumed the air and the sourdough cultures bubbled with particular enthusiasm. Thomas arrived at the shop, carrying a first-edition volume of poetry about transformation, its pages soft with age and careful handling. Inside the front cover, he had written in his careful librarian script, "For Eleanor, who taught me that the most beautiful preservations happen when two stories learn to rise together." Their wedding planning became a community collaboration. That felt like the most natural extension of the shop's mission. Elena designed a ceremonial loaf that would incorporate grains from local farms, each one representing a different aspect of their commitment. Wheat for nourishment, rye for resilience, barley for patience, oats for comfort. The bread would be shaped like a wreath, symbolizing the endless cycle of growth and renewal that marriage represented. Rick created what he called promise pickles, small, perfect vegetables that had been fermented in a brine infused with herbs, known for fostering harmony and deep connection. Each jar would be given to wedding guests as a reminder that love, like fermentation, grew richer and more complex with time, requiring only the right conditions and infinite patience to reach its full potential. Nana Rose supervised the preparations with the satisfied air of someone whose patience had been rewarded exactly as she had known it would be. She contributed her grandmother's wedding recipe for pickled beets that had been aged in wine vinegar, their deep purple color representing the kind of love that could transform even the most ordinary moments into something precious enough to preserve. The ceremony took place in the shop itself, among the glowing jars that had witnessed so many small transformations. Elena wore her mother's simple dress, while Thomas stood beside her in his best suit, both of them radiating the quiet confidence of people who had found their perfect complement. Their vows were spoken in the language they had learned together, promises about creating conditions where love could flourish, about tending each other's growth with the same patience they brought to their crafts. When they shared the ceremonial bread, breaking it with hands that understood the sacred nature of nourishment, Rick felt the deep satisfaction of someone who had learned that his gift was meant to multiply, to create spaces where others could discover their own capacity for. The kind of love that preserved without possessing, that helped without changing the essential nature of what was held. As the evening settled around them like a familiar quilt, Rick watched Elena and Thomas share quiet laughter over plates of bread and pickles, their faces glowing with the particular light that comes from having found someone who understands not just your words, but your heart. He felt the gentle melancholy that comes with witnessing happiness that isn't yours but loving it anyway, understanding that this too was a form of preservation, holding space for others' joy, creating conditions where love could multiply and spread through the community like beneficial bacteria, finding fertile ground. The shop hummed with approval in the patient darkness, hundreds of ongoing transformations, bearing witness to the truth that the most important preservation happened not in individual jars, but in the spaces between hearts committed to the same gentle work of helping each other become more than they could be alone. The gentle rhythm that had settled over the shop after Elena and Thomas's wedding deepened like brine finding its perfect balance, each day bringing small adjustments that felt less like change than like natural deepening. Elena divided her time between the library and the shop with the same organic flow that governed her sourdough's rising, while Thomas often joined them in the evenings, his quiet presence adding another layer of warmth to the space where so many transformations had found their patient home. It was during these settling weeks that Rick began to notice the subtle shifts in Nana Rose, changes so gentle they felt like watching seasons turn rather than witnessing decline. She still moved through the shop with her characteristic grace, but her steps had acquired a more deliberate quality, as if she were savoring each familiar motion. Her hands lingered longer on the jars during their morning rounds, fingers tracing glass surfaces with the tenderness of someone reading beloved stories one more time. She took her tea stronger now, but often left the cup half-finished, her attention drawn to something beyond the window, the way morning light caught the dew on cucumber leaves, or how the wind made patterns in the herb garden that seemed to carry messages only she could read. Rick felt the familiar recognition of someone entering their own season of gentle transformation, though the knowledge settled in his chest with the bittersweet weight of love mixed with inevitable change. "The jars are singing differently," she mentioned one evening as they closed the shop together, her voice carrying the same matter-of-fact tone she used for discussing weather or the progress of particular fermentations. "They know things are changing. They're getting ready to sing for different ears." As autumn painted the world in shades of preservation and preparation, Nana Rose began sharing stories Rick had never heard before, about her own grandmother, who had started the shop with nothing but intuition and faith in slow processes, about the difficult years when the community had forgotten the value of patience, about the quiet persistence required to keep tending something precious when the world demanded immediate results. One morning when frost painted the windows with patterns that looked like preserved lace, she asked Rick to walk the garden with her. Eleanor followed at a respectful distance, understanding the sacred nature of certain lessons. They moved between rows where the last vegetables of the season waited in various states of readiness, each plant carrying its own story of growth and approaching rest. Nana Rose paused beside a bed where summer's abundance had begun its graceful decline. "Choose 3 plants," she said softly, her weathered hand gesturing toward the mix of ready vegetables, those still growing and others that had completed their cycle. "One to harvest now, one to wait on, and one to leave to the earth." Rick moved slowly, his fingers reading the subtle messages each plant offered. He selected a cucumber that yielded with grateful ease, a dill head just shy of its peak, and a spent plant heavy with seeds ready to return to the soil. Nana Rose nodded with the satisfaction of someone whose student had grasped a lesson deeper than words. "There is wisdom in the timing," she said, her palm resting briefly over his. "Harvest, wait, return. If you can recognize which moment you're standing in, you'll rarely be unkind to yourself or others." Back in the cellar, she led him to the ancient crocks that held fermentations begun years, sometimes decades before. These vessels contained more than vegetables. They held the accumulated understanding of what it meant to tend something precious. Over time, to trust in transformations so slow they were almost invisible. Those teach us that the most profound preservation happens not in weeks or months, but in the patient accumulation of years, she explained, opening one crock to reveal vegetables transformed into jewel-toned complexity. When Rick tasted what she offered, he felt the weight of time made edible, patience rewarded with flavors that could only emerge from absolute trust in the process. "This will be your responsibility now," Nana Rose said gently, sealing the crock with movements that looked like blessing. "Not just maintaining these particular fermentations, but understanding what they represent. The commitment to tend something precious, even when you can't see immediate results." That afternoon, she placed a perfect cucumber in his hands, its skin still cool from the garden. "This one is beautiful now," she said, turning it slowly. "Crisp, green, full of life. I could put it in a jar, and it would become something wonderful. But if I tried to hold on to it exactly as it is, it would simply spoil. Love, like life, is a series of transformations. We hold on, we nurture, we create conditions for growth. But then comes the time for gentle release." Rick understood that she wasn't just talking about vegetables. He remembered his own journey away from the shop, the way she had let him go, trusting that his path would lead him back when the time was right. Her lesson was about presence in different forms, about knowing when to offer comfort and when to simply witness with love. As evening settled around them like a familiar quilt, Nana Rose retrieved a narrow box from behind the oldest shelf. Inside lay her apron, its ties soft with years of use, and a key he had never seen, iron worn smooth by countless hands. She placed the key in his palm and tied the apron around his waist with ceremonial care. "Open when you mean it," she said, tapping the key with a gentle finger. "Close when you must. There's no other rule I trust more." That night, Rick stood in the cellar among the glowing jars, turning the old key between his fingers like a prayer made tangible. Elena found him there, sliding her hand into his without words, both of them breathing in rhythm with the room's patient pulse. When they finally climbed the stairs, Nana Rose was dozing in her chair, her face peaceful with the contentment of someone whose deepest work was complete. The days that followed arranged themselves into a gentler pattern, each one bringing Rick deeper into the understanding that inheritance was not just about continuing what had been, but about honoring it enough to let it grow into what it needed to become. In the cellar's patient darkness, surrounded by the soft humming of hundreds of ongoing transformations, he felt the profound weight and gift of stewardship settling around him like light, finding its way through morning windows, illuminating the path ahead with the kind of clarity that comes only from learning to hold precious things with open hands. The seasons turned with their familiar patience after Rick had grown fully into the rhythm of stewardship, each day deepening his understanding that true mastery lay not in perfecting techniques, but in creating conditions where others could discover their own relationship with the gentle arts of preservation. Nana Rose had begun spending more time in her chair by the window, her weathered hands folded like autumn leaves, watching the garden with eyes that seemed to be memorizing each detail. Her transition, when it came, was as graceful as everything else she had ever done. A quiet slipping away on a morning when the cellar's jars hummed their most peaceful song, her face serene with the contentment of someone whose deepest work was complete. The funeral drew people from villages Rick had forgotten existed, faces weathered by honest work, hands that understood the patient arts she had taught. They came carrying stories of comfort found in small jars during difficult seasons, of the way she had helped them understand that healing, like fermentation, happened in its own time and couldn't be rushed. As spring stirred beneath winter's patient blanket, Rick felt the weight of inheritance settling into his bones, like nutrients finding their way into soil. Understanding that the shop required different rhythms now while honoring what had always been. It was during these months of gentle adjustment that Sam appeared, arriving on an afternoon when the first daffodils pushed through the last patches of snow. They were perhaps 17, with hair the color of damp wheat, and eyes that held the particular combination of eagerness and uncertainty that marked those standing at the threshold of their own becoming. Rick felt the familiar tingle of recognition as Sam paused before the cellar door, their hand hovering over the worn wooden handle, with the same wonder he remembered from his own childhood. "I can hear them," Sam whispered, their voice carrying the reverence people used in libraries and churches. "The jars. They're singing something I almost understand." Rick felt time fold gently, connecting this moment to his own first descent into the cellar's patient mysteries. He watched Sam move between the shelves with natural grace, their fingers trailing along glass surfaces with instinctive tenderness. When Sam touched a jar of pickled beets that had been fermenting for nearly 2 years, their face transformed with wonder Rick remembered from his own awakening. "It tastes like someone's grandmother making soup for a sick child," Sam murmured, their voice thick with unexpected emotion, like love that's been saved up for when it's needed most. Rick began Sam's education with the same patience Nana Rose had shown him, understanding that true teaching happened not through instruction, but through creating conditions where natural understanding could unfold. He led Sam to the garden first, their footsteps soft in soil that remembered many hands. "Choose one to harvest, one to wait on, one to return," Rick said, offering Nana Rose's lesson with the gentleness of something beloved. He watched Sam's palms hover, watched their head tilt to catch small messages most people missed. They harvested a cucumber that gave itself with grateful ease, left a dill head to draw one more day of sun, and returned a vine heavy with seed to the earth's open mouth. Back in the cellar, Rick placed 3 jars before them, a bright, easy pickle, a jar mid-ferment clouded with promise, and darker brine that had learned to carry complexity without apology. No right answers, Rick said. Only attention. Sam leaned in, eyes soft, then reached toward the middle jar with a smile that looked like finding a light switch in a familiar room. This one is becoming, they said. It needs someone to sit with it. Eleanor appeared with bread that crackled softly as it cooled, flour tracing constellations on her hands. Sam's gaze caught on the loaf like thirsty land recognizing rain. Eleanor set a heel beside thin slices of Rick's new chapter pickles, and something gentle passed through the air, understanding that nourishment could be both lesson and welcome. When a customer arrived carrying worry in her clenched hands, asking for something for a mother's heart, Rick watched Sam's transformation. Their hands, which had been uncertain before, now moved with instinctive grace, reaching for a jar on a high shelf. Nana Rose's Hope Chest pickles, made with tiny spring onions and infused with elderflower's gentle sweetness. These are for when you're waiting for something you can't control, Sam said, their voice still soft but surprisingly steady. They taste like the promise of spring, even in deepest winter. The woman took the jar, and as her fingers closed around cool glass, Rick saw the same gentle release he had witnessed in Maya years ago. Her shoulders relaxed, a single tear tracing through worry on her cheek. But this tear was different, not of fresh pain but of recognition, of being seen without having to explain. Rick felt profound satisfaction bloom in his chest, warmth spreading like yeast activating in warm water. He watched Sam stand a little straighter, uncertainty in their hands replaced by quiet certainty of purpose. He saw not just an apprentice but continuation, a gentle loop in the ongoing story of preservation. That evening, as they closed the shop, Elena wrapped an arm around Rick's waist. "Your grandmother would be proud," she murmured, watching Sam carefully wipe the counter, humming the old pickling song. Rick simply nodded, understanding that his greatest transformation had been becoming the teacher, learning to pass on not just techniques, but the deep patience and love that made true preservation possible. The cycle continued, gentle and eternal, one patient heart tending another, one story passing its wisdom to the next, creating conditions where healing could multiply like beneficial bacteria, finding fertile ground. The years flowed through the shop like the gentlest brine, each season deepening Rick's understanding that true preservation was never about stopping time, but about honoring its passage, allowing each moment to transform into something that could nourish long after its original form had passed. His hair had begun to carry threads of silver that caught the cellar's lamplight like captured starlight, and his hands moved with the same unhurried certainty that had once belonged only to Nana. Rose, the boy who had first touched glass jars with wonder, had grown into a man whose presence carried the quiet depth of 1,000 patient fermentations. Sam had flourished under Rick's gentle guidance, their sensitivity to the subtle languages of fermentation becoming as instinctive as breathing. They moved through the shop with natural grace, their hands already knowing which vegetables were ready for transformation, which customers needed comfort, and which needed the kind of gentle challenge that helped them grow. Rick watched them with the same quiet pride that had once glowed in Nana Rose's eyes, understanding that his greatest transformation had been learning to become the teacher, to pass on not just techniques, but the deep patience and love that made true preservation possible. The community that had formed around the shop had expanded in ways that felt as organic as sourdough culture spreading through willing dough. Helena's bakery had become a sister sanctuary, where bread and stories rose together, while Thomas had begun teaching classes on the ancient connections between food and narrative. Maya, now a mother herself, brought her daughter to learn the patient arts, the child's small hands already showing the telltale sensitivity that marked those called to the gentle work of transformation. It was during one of these quiet teaching moments that Rick created what would become the shop's most beloved addition. In the center of the cellar, he placed an empty jar, the largest they owned, positioning it where the afternoon light could find it through the small window. "What will it hold?" Sam asked, already sensing that this was about something deeper than vegetables. Rick's smile came from a place of profound understanding. "Everything we've learned to preserve," he said gently. "The quiet moments, the song the jars make when they're content, the way people breathe when they feel truly seen, the relief that comes with letting go." He poured nothing into the jar, yet somehow it began to feel full, as if intention itself were a substance with weight. They placed a simple tag beside it, "Jar of Remembering." People began to pause near it without quite knowing why, their shoulders relaxing, their eyes softening as if recognizing a place in themselves that had been waiting for acknowledgement. Some touched the glass and smiled. Some exhaled deeply. Some whispered thanks to no one in particular. It held no pickles, but it preserved a way of listening to life that tasted like coming home. As autumn painted the world in shades of grateful release, Rick felt the first whisper of his own approaching season of transformation. Not illness or sudden decline, but the gentle recognition that comes to those who have learned to read the signs of natural cycles. He was sitting in the cellar among the glowing jars when he felt it. The same gentle loosening he had sensed in vegetables ready to surrender their old forms to become something more nourishing. The understanding settled in his chest like warm honey, bringing not sadness but profound completion. He had learned to be gentle with his own becoming, to recognize when holding on tightly would only diminish what was meant to be shared. His stretching, as Nana Rose might have called it, had been about becoming softer, more adaptable, more open to the subtle currents of life. It was about stretching his heart to encompass more, to hold more, to love more deeply. In the cellar's patient darkness, Rick shared his final lessons with Sam. "The most important thing," he said, his weathered hands resting gently on Sam's shoulders, "is understanding that you are not the architect of anyone's healing. You are simply someone who learned to create conditions where their own wisdom can remember itself." The transition, when it came, was as gentle as everything else Rick had learned to do. He simply closed his eyes one evening while sitting among the jars that had been his teachers, his face peaceful with the contentment of someone whose deepest work was complete. Sam found him there at dawn, surrounded by the glowing constellation of preserved love he had tended for so many years. As spring stirred beneath winter's patient blanket, Sam settled into the rhythms of stewardship with the same organic grace that had marked Rick's own journey. The shop continued to draw those who carried hurts they couldn't quite name, seeking something they couldn't articulate, but recognized the moment they tasted it. The jar of remembering held its invisible harvest with quiet grace, and the cellar hummed with the accumulated wisdom of generations. Years later, when Sam's own hair began to carry threads of silver, they would sit among the glowing jars and understand that they too were being gently preserved, pickled in the brine of countless small kindnesses, fermented into something more nourishing than they ever imagined possible. The shop would continue, the jars would continue to whisper their patient songs, and somewhere in the eternal cycle of transformation, every act of love would be perfectly preserved, and with that gentle exhale, Rick settled into the eternal brine of stars, where every story is perfectly preserved, and every transformation is held with infinite love, his legacy living on in every jar that learned to sing, in every heart that discovered its own capacity for patient tenderness, in the endless conversation between those who choose to hold precious things with open hands. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, friend.